On the catch-up today, we've heard that the Islamist insurgency in the north of Mozambique saw Ansar al-Sunnah, or more locally known as Al-Shabaab, of course, emerge as an Islamist organization there. Now, in October of 2017, they then launched their first attack. And this week, Mozambique's defense forces then confirmed that attacks had been launched on several villages near the port of Mocimboa de Praia in order to occupy the town. It's the third attack this year and had been claimed by the Islamic State Central Africa province. Now, the attacks in the northern region have killed hundreds of people and displaced thousands more since it began in 2017. And the presence of ISIL-affiliated violent extremists in the northern provinces of Mozambique has raised the threat level in southern Africa. Now, should there be serious concerns over the situation in Mozambique and its impact in the SADC region, we ask. Well, Roland Henwood, a political science lecturer at the University of Pretoria, joins us to discuss a little bit further. Well, very good morning to you, Roland Henwood. Thank you for joining us here on Weekend Dawn. I mean, just looking at the political and economic situation in Mozambique to date, I mean, what is the history of the conflict in Mozambique as we, as we take a look back at that context?
Good morning, Liesl. Thank you. I think it's quite important that one focus on the historical context. If we go back in the history of Mozambique, you've had the War of Liberation. That was followed by a civil war that lasted 16 years. And although the peace agreement between Renamo and Frelimo was agreed in 1992, we actually saw in early 2017 a real engagement that led to a suspension of the hostilities, the hostilities between the two political organizations. So you have a history of conflict, of violence, and of serious abuses of the population by both Frelimo as government and Renamo as an opposition group, especially in the northern parts of Mozambique. And that sets the backdrop for the current developments that are taking shape.
So you spoke about the history of the conflict and the abuses. There's also the issue of poor governance that comes to the fore. As you mentioned, the peace agreements between the Frelimo and the Renamo obviously happened in 1992, but ultimately perpetuated the cycle of violence. I mean, how would you contextualize the issue of poor governance as a result too?
Well, I think firstly one must look at Mozambique as a country, and it is one of the poorest countries in the world. And then if you start looking within Mozambique, you go to the northern parts of Mozambique, the extreme northern parts, you find the most marginalized of the population. You find massive poverty in Mozambique. More than half of the population lives below the poverty line. Yeah. So you have huge problems with poverty and marginalization. And in the northern parts, especially the deep rural parts of northern Mozambique, there is effectively no governance. What resembles governance is police and military forces, and often they abuse their position. They are very harsh in their dealings with the local population, and that creates a sense of marginalization, but also of alienation. And that makes it very difficult to in any way engage with the population and in any way get a sense of engagement that is going to be positive. So it's always a question of treating people literally as the enemy and as not worth anything. And that sets the scene for extremely difficult engagements between the society and government. Of course, it's also an environment built on fear, and that leads to serious distrust. And that underpins what is happening at this stage in the northern parts of Mozambique.
So speaking about the marginalization, the fear and the distrust that obviously arises, I just want to look at the broader context of the northern parts of Mozambique. I mean, ultimately how outsiders have managed to then come into this environment. I mean, we've seen, the religious, and people are questioning whether it's an issue of religious intolerance because it is affiliated to ISIL. Walk us through how that the role of religion and also poor governance is impacting that region as the extremism and violence seems to be escalating with the number of deaths and people displaced.
I think it's important to understand that in the first instance, what we see in northern Mozambique is not an external influence that is coming into northern Mozambique and creating instability. What we see is domestic issues and what is happening on the ground. And again, there's an historical context of Islam as a religion, especially in the northern parts of Mozambique, with ties to what happens in the outside world that goes back, way back in history. This is not a recent phenomenon. Secondly, I think it's important to understand that what happens in northern Mozambique started within northern Mozambique. It is not something that where people came in from outside of the country and started to foment this uprising. The uprising started within Mozambique as a result of limited opportunities, the marginalization and the alienation that I referred to, and that is associated with religion. But it started in a domestic context, especially youths in the area that felt even more marginalized. They had no opportunities, they have no expectation of the future, and they started rejecting the religious context that existed. In other words, the mainstream religious context, and started to engage in actions that were more criminal. But these opportunities later started to grow, and they saw that they could create opportunities for themselves by engaging in illicit acts. And that formed the backdrop against which it became a more militant engagement. And then you had the influence of religion, some strands of Islamism that were, in a sense, accepted, that were available on the outside of that area. And then you have the cross-border links that are starting to develop where people are taking advantage of the situation. But it is still not clear that what happens in northern Mozambique is a classical example of the fundamentalist religious conflicts that you have seen in the Middle East and even in East Africa and some parts of West Africa. There are similarities, but there are also very important differences.
So on that note, what are some of the activities of the violent extremists that we've witnessed in those parts, which seems to be escalating? What is the impact on women? What is government's responses been? I mean, ultimately, how does this also impact SADC at large?
I think important is that the initial response of government was to deny that there was anything of this nature happening in northern Mozambique. And the indication was that they thought if they ignore this long enough, it will go away, it will resolve itself. The second phase was extremely harsh and repressive and violent reaction from government. And that, of course, aggravated the situation because it undermined the little bit of options that were available in terms of building a capacity, but also building a relationship that could deal with the issue. So what you find is a deepening of the divisions, hardening of attitudes, and you find violence begetting violence. And that, of course, is completely the wrong way of dealing with a situation such as this. So the context is that there is now a real possibility of this conflict growing and developing cross-border impacts. In other words, the first place where one would probably see this will be across the border into the southern parts of Tanzania. And we see the Tanzanian government reacting very strongly. They are deploying troops. They want to secure their southern border. They want to prevent this from spilling over into southern Tanzania. There's also the argument that there are links that goes back into East Africa, into Kenya and Somalia, between some of the leadership in these radicalized groupings. But again, it's not clear that at this stage you are dealing with a transnational terrorist organization. You are rather dealing with individuals that are linking up and trying to make the best of the situation that they find themselves in and creating opportunities for themselves. That, of course, does not legitimize violence, but it is the way it is at this stage. So, now, the question is, what is going to happen? Is SADC going to step in? And there we would have to see what happens on Monday when the next SADC leadership meeting takes place.
Which actually was my next question, because obviously we have to look at SADC's approach, the African Union's approach, beyond a militarized approach. I mean, what do you think are the options at hand as we speak ahead of that meeting?
Well, I think first option is the Mozambican government needs to step up and take responsibility for what happens and also for what happened in northern Mozambique. It is a domestic issue. It needs to be resolved by domestic governance action. It is not clear if the government has the will or the ability to actually engage at this level and deal with the issue. Secondly, the question of SADC, which is the regional body. And again, there are questions, does SADC have the will and the ability to engage and step in? I think what is important here is the principle that underlies engagement in SADC, and that is national sovereignty and non-interference. So ultimately, the decision in the first instance would be, what does the Mozambican government want and what would they allow? And that becomes more important because the Mozambican president, Mr. Newzroom, is taking over as SADC chair from Monday. So he is going to have quite a lot of influence in deciding what's going to happen at this stage. There are indications and speculation that he would prefer a bilateral engagement, and in the sense of getting Zimbabwe to help him and not other SADC members. There seems to be less of a willingness to accept South Africa, for instance, as a direct role player in this process. Of course, that excludes the question of does South Africa want to get involved in this. So at this stage, it's not very clear what will happen. There are options, there are possibilities, but I think one would have to wait and see what happens at the next SADC leadership meeting and then see how it plays out from there. At this stage, the issue has not been something that is high on the agenda of the African Union. But if the problem persists and grows and it becomes an Eastern African problem as well, it is quite likely that the African Union will become involved, and that may change the dynamics of the process.
Yeah, I mean, there's also so many deaths and thousands more displaced. So it will be interesting to see what the humanitarian approach will be, obviously, as that SADC meeting is set to take place on Monday. But we thank Roland Henwood, lecturer at the University of Pretoria, again, for joining us to discuss the updates in Mozambique regarding the Islamist insurgency in the northern parts of Mozambique and its potential impact on the SADC region.